Hi, this is Tim Young with Elevate Software, and this is going to be a video about the differences in the IDE, or the differences and changes in the IDE between Elevate Web Builder 2 and Elevate Web Builder 3. I'm going to be doing several videos here for the various changes between Elevate Web Builder 2 and Elevate Web Builder 3. This one will concentrate on the IDE, of course, but the other ones will concentrate or do a deeper dive on some of the changes regarding the database API, server applications, and how those all work. And so look for those. Those will be followed up, or those will be following this video very shortly. Hopefully it'll be all up this week, the week of the 27th of October, and that'll help give everybody a good, at least a good floor of knowledge in terms of how to get going with Elevate Web Builder 3, especially if you have existing Elevate Web Builder 2 applications that are out in production already. So the first thing you're going to want to do before you even start up the Elevate Web Builder 3 IDE is to go ahead and run a utility. You only have to do this the first time you start up the IDE, or before the first time you start up the IDE. If you do start up the IDE without doing this step, you'll see an error message in the IDE saying that it can't start the internal web server in the IDE because it doesn't have or doesn't see the local host certificate, so it can't start the secure socket or the HTTPS socket for the web server. The utility that you want is going to be found in the program file sub folders. It's going to be under Elevate Web Builder 3. In this case, I'm using the beta, so there's beta at the end, but if you're using the final release, it's not going to have the beta portion. It's in the bin folder, EWB cert folder, and then Win32, because it's a 32-bit command line executable. So there's a couple different ways you can run this. If you ever have any questions about what the parameters are, you can simply run it without any parameters, and it will tell you what those are. The other way you can do it too is if you run it with just the name of the certificate that you want to check on, then it'll tell you if that certificate has already been installed. If you're not familiar with how certificates work in Windows, they are based similar, or they are designed similarly to the registry, in the sense that, and a lot of other things in Windows, that you have a per user account certificate store, and then you have a system-wide certificate store. The system-wide certificate store requires administrative privileges for most of the, or probably all the privilege, or all the operations that you would perform on that store. So Elevate Web Builder concentrates on, or limits itself to the current user account store or certificate store for dealing with the local host certificate for development. So to go ahead and get this set up, though, what you're going to want to do is you're going to type in EWB cert. You're going to type in the name of the certificate. In this case, it's localhost. You're going to want that to be localhost. And then -C will go ahead and create it. As you can see, when I ran it without the -C, though, I already have it installed, but this will just simply check and see if it's installed, and if it's not, it'll go ahead and install it. So now that I've run that, I can go ahead and start up the IDE. If you do encounter any errors there, if you get confused or something's not working right, feel free to contact us and we'll get things straight for you. But it should be a pretty simple operation. So let's go ahead and start up the IDE. Okay. So once we got the IDE, the second step that you're going to want to perform is to go ahead and install the example applications. When you click on this, it's going to go ahead and install everything from the program files subfolder over to the user-specific documents folder. It's going to specifically put it in the Elevate Web Builder 3 subfolder tree, and then there's going to be several example applications in there. So once you've got those installed, that'll give you basically the ability to play around with those and modify them and run them. You're not going to be able to do that from the actual program file subfolder. You're going to get a lot of errors, especially about modifications. So let's go ahead and deal with the what I'm going to do here is I'm going to work from the main menu and kind of work my way around the IDE to the various areas and just cover each area in terms of what's changed, what's new, and things that you're going to want to be aware of. So at the very top, of course, we have the main menu. The main change here, of course, is it's not a drop-down menu anymore. It's actually a ribbon-style menu. It's not exactly like an Office ribbon-style menu, but it's somewhat like that. It's kind of a hybrid between a drop-down menu and the Office-style menus. You can still use the Alt key to go ahead and access the main menu, and then use the arrow keys to move back and forth. You can use the up and down arrow keys to move into a sub-menu, and use the Alt down arrow to drop down, escape to move backwards. So it works pretty much similarly to a drop-down menu. Same with Alt F/S or any keystroke combinations you might do with a drop-down menu. Those work exactly the same. So it shouldn't be too big of a deal. The main thing that we're going for here with the ribbon style menu is just to make things a little bit more discoverable for new users, so things aren't really buried in menu options, and it's a little bit more apparent what the various meanings of the various options on the menu are. So let's see. So the panels for the various areas of the IDE have changed a little bit, in the sense that they're still fixed. You can't drag and drop them. They're not dockable, but they are collapsible. And I think that's a nice middle road between those two options. So the two ways you can do it is you can click on the collapse icon, which will collapse it over to its area, or you can double click on the title bar of the panel. So any one of these I can double click on, and it'll go ahead and move them or collapse them over to their side. And that'll give you some additional screen real estate when you need it. So okay, let's go ahead and start first and foremost with the settings, because that's going to control a lot of the various things you're going to see in the IDE. The settings used to be called environment options. Now they're just settings, and they're off the main file menu. And under project, the first thing you're going to notice that's different is the default ancestor request handler class. That's been added to be used with server applications. The request handler class it's similar to a database or a form. But it's unlike a form and more like a database. It's a non-user interface container. So you can drop basically non-visual components on there, things like server requests and databases or data sets. So you can use those with the request handler. The way the request handlers work is it's effectively just an entry point for the incoming request from the client into the web server, and allows you to effectively handle it, or you can dispatch it to other request handlers if you wanted. In most cases, you're probably only going to have one request handler in any given server application. But it's also possible to have different ancestor classes there too, although that's probably not going to be something that's going to happen anytime soon. But the next thing you're going to notice that's different is you've got the default project deployment structure for new projects. Again, this is new projects, so this only affects how a new project is set up. And what it does, it gives you the ability to do the traditional way was you would just deploy into the root folder, and then you would have the name of the project or the name of the output files for the project match the name of the project. So that would keep those separate from one another. So if you had my application as the name of the project, it would get deployed into the root folder for the web server. And it would be called myapplication.js. If you're doing a client application, it would be myapplication.js for the JavaScript, and then myapplication.html for the application loader file. The new aspect of this is you do have an option to deploy into project-specific folders. Now, what that does then is that this enables this particular option, which is to be able to specify the default output file name. Or the base part of the file name. So what this does is it gives you the ability to say, okay, my project's called my application. So when this deploys, it's going to, or when it sets up the new project, it's going to set up the deployment path as my application, and then it's going to set the output file names as default. So it'll be default.js and default.html. And those are, again, will reside under the My Application subfolder in the content folder for the web server, which we'll see a little bit more about that when we get into server management. That'll be explained then. So you have two different options setting those up. You can, after the fact, after you've done this, obviously change all these around. So again, these are just for new projects. So it's just a way to streamline how you set up your projects based on your preferences. So let's see. Okay, so move on to editor. Previously, there was a option for allow the cursor in white space. That's been broken out into two separate options now. There's an option to allow the cursor in the leading white space and an option to allow the cursor in the trailing white space. So that's just basically giving you a little bit more finer grain control over that option. The other big option is the enabling of the code assistance. That is enabled by default. The default delay is 400 milliseconds. When we get into the code editor, I'll get a little bit more in depth about this, but code assistance is effectively IntelliSense is one name for that Microsoft uses. I can't remember what Delphi uses for it. Code completion. But effectively what it does is it gives you the ability while you're typing to get lookups automatically pop up that will give you information on what the available namespace, properties, methods, events, classes, whatever happens to be available within the context of where you're typing, so that you don't have to remember the names of everything, which is handy. It's something that's been needed for quite a while in Elevate Web Builder. So in the editor display, only a few extra things here. There's a new option for the line info text because there are now line numbers in the code editor. So that gives you the option to specify what color you want to use there. And then there's also new options for enabled breakpoints and disabled breakpoints and the debug line. All three of those are used with server applications because at this time, you can only debug in the IDE server applications. You can't debug the browser applications themselves in the IDE at this time. But that is something that is coming probably within a few months here. What we have to do is we have to swap out Internet Explorer for the new Edge and get the debugging all hooked up. But once that's all done, then this will also apply to client applications. All right, so that's pretty much it for the settings. Everything else is pretty much the same. There hasn't been any changes in any of that. So let's get out of that. And okay, moving on to what I'm going to do now is going to go through the various aspects of the main menu and what's new in each one. So under new project, this used to be under submenu. What you have new here is previously you had visual client projects and then you had non-visual client projects. Both of those being client projects that run in the browser. This is now a new option. It's the server projects, which allows you to start a project that can be compiled and deployed to the server and run on the server completely. It's an interpreted application. And again, we're going to go more of a deep dive video, separate video for the server applications and how they all work. But when we get to the server management aspect of this video, you'll be able to see a little bit more about how that works. So let's see, for open, you're now going to see that there's MRU, most recently used file lists under each one of the open options for opening projects, opening units, or opening control interfaces. You can either select one of those options, or you can also do a directly open it from a folder using the common Windows dialogues. So that's slightly different. The nice thing about that is it gives you a lot more ability, or a lot longer list of MRU options than what you had before. So especially because it's scrollable. So moving on to the project menu. So let's go ahead and move on to that. Oh, wait a minute. Let's go ahead and open up a project so we can see what we're... So I'm going to open up a client project here. This is one of the sample applications. It's the music collection client. The music collection sample application, like most of them, there's two major sample applications, and both of them have a client and a server component to them. So there is a client application, and then there's a server application that deals with the API. But if I go ahead and move over to project now, you're going to see these options enabled, including project options. This was named the same in Elevate Web Builder 2, but some of the naming is different in the project options. General used to be called application. It's just general now. What's new here is there's a version number. The title and version number, actually not the version number, but just the title, used to be something that was actually embedded into the actual project source. That has actually changed to where now the compiler will build that both the title and the version number into the actual loader file, and then the application will actually retrieve that information. So it effectively stamps the application with that information. So it's a lot easier than having the source code management have to keep updating that in the project source. The other thing that's different here is the icon file, which is just the little ICO icon, Windows icon that's displayed in the browser address bar in certain browsers. I'm not entirely sure how many still do it. I think Edge still does it. But the main difference here is that this used to be an absolute file name or absolute path and file name. And you can still do that, but there's also this new button with an R, which allows you to convert the absolute path to a relative path. So for example, if I go in here and say I've got the icon here, if I put it in here, if I click on R, it's going to create it, change it to a relative path. Now, the relative path in this case is relative to the root project folder. So everything that deals with absolute versus relative paths in reference to projects is going to be done relative to the root folder for the project. So just so you know. Next is startup. Startup used to be called forms and databases. It was changed to startup because now we have not only forms and databases, but with server applications you have request handlers. But it works effectively the same way in that you have various designer instances that can be marked as auto create, and the rest have to be manually created in code to be shown at runtime. And then you can designate one of those as the main form, which is, or in the case of the server applications, the main request handler that is going to be automatically created and shown at runtime when the application starts up. Let's see. Build used to be called compilation. It's now just called build, obviously. Now the new thing here is you have the compiler defines. This allows you to set per project, and that's project-wide compiler defines that control conditional compilation of the application, which is nice. Search paths has also been changed to now, as you can see, now allow for relative paths also. So you can go in there and change those to be either absolute or relative. In this case, both of these are relative paths, which is nice because you can move around your projects then without having to worry about having to change these paths constantly. The output path used to be only relative. It now actually allows you to set an absolute output path. So if you're basically dumping things out to a completely different drive or out into a file server for deployment, to a non-Elevate Web Builder web server, for example, you can basically set that to an absolute path. The R relative button works the same way, though. You can effectively convert the output path to an absolute output path to a relative output path. The loader and script are the same. Those were there, same compress output. The only other new thing is that we now have a icon font name. And this was necessary to allow and it should have been in there prior with Elevate Web Builder too, but it's something that we missed. It allows you to basically designate the font family name, so that if you choose a different icon font than the one that's shipped with Elevate Web Builder, which is normally called EWB icons, and it's effectively a stripped down version of Font Awesome, just to keep the size down. In this particular case, with this client application, and also with the other photo album sample application that comes with the Elevate Web Builder, you'll notice that the icon font being used is the Google Material Icons font, not the Elevate Web Builder Font Awesome font. So this now gives you the ability to effectively replace the icons in your application with another icon font of your choosing, which is nice, because in this particular case we were going for a material design look and feel, so that's why we use that particular icon font. So okay, now back to the project menu itself. We just looked at project options. There used to be some quick compiler options over in the project manager toolbar. Those have now been moved up to the main project menu, and it used to be just compress output. You now have the ability to control show hints and show warnings. Then you have the build project button here, which is effectively the same as compile project in Elevate Web Builder 2. They're both going to just do a minimal compile, whatever's needed to get a completed application. So if part of the application has already been compiled, it's not going to rebuild the whole thing. It's just simply going to compile whatever it needs. If it needs to be emitted, it'll go ahead and emit it. So the deployment server and path, the deployment has changed quite a bit. The deployment is now specific to the Elevate Web Builder web server. So the two pieces of information that you're going to need here are which server do I want to deploy to, and you can choose from any of the defined servers that are available. Those defined servers are controlled by the server manager. As you can see here, I have two different ones. There's the internal, which is auto-created for you by Elevate Web Builder, and then I have one external web server called Test. So those are the ones that are available here to choose from for deployment. In the path here, this one is blank. This is what you will see if you have your settings set up to for the default project deployment structure. If you have it set to deploy into root folder, when you create a new project, this is what it's going to look like. If you had it deployed into a project specific folder, then this will actually have the name of the project listed there. Elevate Web Builder will keep that updated for you if you do rename the project or change the name in any way, if it matches. So if you set this to something different than the project name, it won't update it. But if it is matched or does match the project name, it'll auto update when you change the name of the project. And then of course you have the deploy project button here, which will go ahead and deploy the project. The way the deployment works is it will check the file, each file that needs to be deployed, and see if it's changed by the timestamp and the size. And if they have changed in any way, it will go ahead and deploy it. Otherwise, you will get a message at the bottom of the IDE saying that it hasn't changed, and so it won't deploy it. And that just keeps the deployment time down when you're doing an auto deploy while you're running the application in the IDE for debugging purposes, or just to see what the output is. So okay, so run menu is the next menu. It's very similar to the deployment in that you choose one of the servers to run against. The internal web server that's built into the IDE always has a deploy on run checked. For other web servers, you can choose that option or not choose that option. During development, it's probably best that you always have that option turned on, because that will ensure that you're always running the version of the application that you have in the IDE on the actual external web server. The parameters are the same as they were with Elevate Web Builder 2. These are the URL parameters, so you would basically have ampersand parameter equals key value pairs. listed there. So that gives you the way to, when you're running client applications in the IDE, to specify what URL parameters you might want to include on those. Those get passed into the application. So the next thing you see here is for client application, this hasn't changed at all. You have your run application and stop application. So sorry about that. I keep forgetting Camtasia has F9 set up for pausing, so a little blip there. I'll go ahead and click on run application, and that will go ahead and run the application in the browser. So when you have this, you can run it, and then of course you can stop it, or you can just close the window and that'll stop it. So that's pretty much it when it comes to for the client applications at the moment. When the debugging support is added for client applications in the IDE, you're going to see more options here. But let's go and open up the server application for the music collection example app, and then you're going to see in the run menu we have a lot more options here. So if I go to run this, there's a few things that are in play here that aren't in play with client applications. So first thing is the request. What Elevate Web Builder does is it allows you to set up requests using the request manager, which is over here in the managers area, and you just click on request tab at the bottom, and this gives you all the various requests that are, a lot of these are already set up as part of the example applications when you do the install example applications option. But what these do is it allows you to effectively drive the server application with specific content, parameters, or any type of specific HTTP request, which makes it very easy to test out a server application without necessarily having to go through the trouble of running a client application or stepping into a client application to access a specific option that exercises a certain part of the server application. Eventually, what we're going to be able to do here, and it's just not possible yet, but is to be able to set this up, or set up the requests into a test session so that you can effectively just batch run a set of API requests against a server application to ensure that the server application is running as expected. So it'll be available as automated testing, and there will be a command line version of that also, which will be nice. So in this particular case, I'm just using the set track media ID, which is one of the API calls for the server application for the music collection example app. And what it does is just sets the YouTube media ID for that particular track, because the music collection is effectively a collection of albums with various tracks on each album. But what you're going to see is that after I run this here, I have a couple breakpoints set, because again, you can set breakpoints in the server applications. So if I run this, you're going to see that I get a lot of additional options here for being able to step over, step into, or step out, or just resume the application, or just reset the application and stop it. Furthermore, on the left here, you're going to see I have call stack information. You can double click on any one of these, and it'll take you to that particular line, and it'll open up the local variables inspector, which allows you to look at any particular local variables that are present in context, of course, and look and see what their various values are, which is really nice when you're trying to debug what's going on with the server application. You can pretty much see just about everything here, including all the private members of class instances. So, and then you have your breakpoints, of course, still. You can enable and disable breakpoints. You can double click on those also. It'll take you right to the breakpoint line. And then, of course, we can just go ahead and step over here. And again, this is a remote debugger. So you can do this against any web server, any Elevate Web Builder web server. So you can do that. If you're in the United States, this web server could be in Europe, and you'd be able to still do the remote debugging, which is going to be nice when you have a server that's not on premises. So we'll go ahead and resume here. And so what you're going to see too is after you, while you execute the application, and then after it's executed, down in the messages area here, you can double click on these. You can double click on the executing debug information, and it'll tell you what the HTTP request was, the URL, along with the parameters, and which headers were sent over, including any content, textual content that was sent over also. If you send binary content, it'll tell you what the size of the binary content was. And then furthermore, when the request is complete, it gives you information about the status received, and also how long it took. And you can double click on that also, and it'll give you the exact response that came back from the web server itself. So that's nice to see. So that's pretty much it for the run stuff for the server applications. Again, we're probably going to go, or I'm going to go more into that with the separate video for the server applications. So, and also, like I said, if we do a live stream with Q&A, then we can take any questions you have on how any of that works. So moving on to the library menu. The only new option here is, well, there's a couple minor things. One is obviously, because we now have client applications and server applications, you'll notice all the options for adding components to the library now have this option to specify which library you're trying to add it to. The client library or the server library. And they are distinctly different from one another. They do share some code in the component library. So for example, server requests have a bunch of conditional compilation directives in the source code to handle client versus server. But for the most part, or from the developer's perspective, they work essentially the same. There's only some additional options for the server stuff that's not available in browsers. But the new option here is going to be the new external module interface. Now, what this does is this allows you to effectively choose an already pre-built external module. Now, what is an external module? Real briefly, the interpreter that runs server applications is a general purpose Object Pascal interpreter. And what it does is it does give you the ability to surface native Object Pascal code in the form of a special type of DLL into the interpreter's namespace, so you can inject classes and global variables and all sorts of things from native code into the interpreter, so that the interpreter or your code can use that native code as if it was built into the interpreter, just like the built-ins that come with the runtime library. So in this case, I'm going to choose one of the example native modules that are included. There's two of them that are included with Elevate Web Builder. One is the external class type, and the other one's the external namespace. Those both are available with the Elevate Web Builder modules installation, which is a separate download and install. And what that does is that installation includes these two projects and built versions of the two projects. And they also include a template project for these types of modules, so that you can very easily set one up and use it. So let's go ahead and do the namespace. So what this does is this is going to go ahead and generate Object Pascal code that can be included in your application, so that it knows how to access the native classes, functions, procedures, whatever is in the module. And as you can see here, there's a few things. There's enumerated types in here. There's a couple there's a function and procedure here. Then there's some global variables also. We can also do the other one real quick, and it'll give you an idea what that one looks like. Yeah, and here you can see it's surfaced a couple enumerated types, and it's also surfaced a class called tVehicle that has several different properties, and then a method for estimating the value. So these are very basic examples, of course, but it just goes to show you how easy it is once you have one of these external modules set up, how easy it is to generate the code so that you don't have to actually manually generate any of that. The one thing that isn't supported, and again, we'll go into this in more detail with server applications, but I thought I'd just mention it. The one thing that isn't supported is the default values for parameters. Those you're going to have to add manually afterwards. Unfortunately, Delphi does not surface that information in the runtime type information, so it's not possible to get that information. So that has to be added after the fact. It doesn't really materially change things too much, but it does determine whether you can call something with a missing parameter or not. So that's the library menu. So moving on to the help menu is pretty much the same as it's always been. So there's no difference there. So moving on to the tools panel. The tools panel obviously is over here. We're going to start with the client application. Tools panel is over here on the left. And depending on whether you're running a client application or a server application, this will look different. In this case, this is the client application. So what you're going to see here is this is a new aspect of the tools panel. This is the component navigator, which allows you to very easily, in both layout order or tab order, navigate through all the various controls, and also see which controls are actually there, which is useful when you have things that are hidden behind other things. You can also rename any component in the navigator by just using F2, and so I can change this to whatever. I'm not going to do that right now, but it gives you another option for renaming separate from using the properties inspector, which you can also use that to rename a given component. You can also do drag and drop in the navigator. So for example, if I wanted within the same container, you can't drag and drop outside of a given container. But if I wanted to, I could drag and drop and change the layout order of various components on here. The other option here is the component library. This used to be the component palette, used to be at the top. In Elevate Web Builder 2 used to be at the top of the menu, or at the top of the IDE, right below the main menu. It's effectively the same thing, but just in a collapsible category-based list now. So you can collapse all these so that you can save some space. You can also filter these. So for example, if I wanted to look for just buttons, I can just type in button and it'll tell me all the various components that are available that are buttons. And again, this component library is going to change depending on whether I've got a client application or a server application. In this case, with the client application, I have quite a few. Server applications don't have nearly as many components available. So you're going to see that changes a little bit. Pull up see, we only have 3 at this time, but there's most of the server application runtime library is components and things that you kind of used at runtime, and you don't necessarily drop them onto a request handler. So that's mainly the main reason that's so much less than the client applications. But as things move on, we're going to be adding more and more functionality. So right now it's a little limited, but it will get it'll become more fleshed out as things go. Let's put it back to the client here. Okay, so moving on to the property inspector. This has actually now been moved in to be part of what we call the work area or the designer space. And the reason for that was to allow you to be able to use the navigator and have the property inspector right nearby. I don't like the stacked version as much because you don't have as much space to work with in the navigator, especially when you're talking about a very complicated designer instance. And the same thing when you're talking about the properties inspector, is that it's a little constrained. You end up scrolling a lot to get to various properties if you have them stacked. So this way, it's a lot easier. You can see both at a glance, and your eye flows nicely from one to the other. Some of the changes in the property inspector include, you'll notice that we now have the ability to designate whether something's been modified from the default or not. If it is, it's bolded. So this gives you a nice overhead view to see what has actually been changed or what hasn't been changed in a given component, which is very nice. You can also now double click on nested values to expand and collapse that particular nested property. In this case, like for example, auto size, you've always been able to double click over here in the property name, but now you can also double click in the property value, because there's no way to really edit these. These are just read-only labels anyway, so that's just easier, so you don't have to always remember to double click over here to expand it and collapse those. The other thing that was added was you now have the ability to, like say we take the background property, you can use the Control-Alt-Down keystrokes to expand and collapse the entire set of properties underneath the currently selected property, whereas previously you only had the Alt-Down. So I'll use Alt-Down here. As you can see with Alt-Down, it doesn't expand everything. It's not a nested expand and collapse. It's just a single layer or a single level expand and collapse. So that's a nice addition if you want to, especially with the background property, is one of those ones that has a lot of nested properties underneath the background property. So that's nice. And then finally, this is a very nice option also, is you can go in here and say, for example, we change the background to like say Gainsborough, and then we find out, oops, I don't want to do that. So what we can do here is you can just hit the Control R key, and it will reset the background back to the default values. In this case, that's a transparent background. So that's a very nice feature, especially when we're talking about these nested properties that have a lot of sub-properties. Okay, so that's the property inspector. Let's move on to the code editor. Okay, a few changes here. The source code management for the code editor was completely rewritten. It used to be all part of the editor, and that, including the tokenizing for the syntax highlighting, that got all moved into the actual source code management in the compiler, which provides a couple nice things. One is performance improvements, especially for things like code assistance. And the second thing is it gives you the ability to, or gives us the ability to make the source code management fully reactive. So the editor itself is actually very minimal, and it simply just responds to a series of events that occur in the source code management. So it gives the source code management the ability to tokenize everything. So everything really in the compiler from that point deals with pre-tokenized source code, which again improves the performance and gives us the ability to do a lot more interactive code management features. So the only other things that have changed are you have the find and replace used to have directional buttons. So like if I hit Control F here to pull up the find, these used to be directional buttons. These are now one-off find and replace buttons, so that you can just click on those and it'll look for either forward or reverse. It'll look for that whatever you're searching for. So those are an actual action button, not just a toggle button. Is same for the find and replace. Same thing. You have these two buttons are changed. The other addition is there's a go to line number option, which is Control G, and that allows you to go to a specific line. I'm not exactly sure why we didn't have that prior. It should have been in there. As I mentioned before, you do have the line numbers now that are visible on the left-hand gutter also, which is nice. We did have the change indicators in there, but ran into some issues with how we're managing the changes in the undo and redo history in the source code management. So that actually had to be removed for final release, but we'll get back on that and get that fixed. So that'll basically give you like a yellow bar indicator of which aspects of the source code have changed since the last save. So that's nice to see. Also, obviously code assistance has been added. So for example, we can go in here and there's a couple ways you can do it. One is you can just type, and then after the code assistance delay, it'll go ahead and give you some options as to what the various options are. In this case, I want to do application, so I can just hit enter or tab and it'll select it, and then it'll start giving me the properties for the global application. So I can do title, and then you can just type in whatever. So that's effectively how Code Assistant works, just pretty much like every other product out there in terms of how the Code Assistant works. Nothing really new there. It's not 100% sensitive. Like it's a little bit dumb about unit names still and parameter names, which it could be a little smarter about some of those things. And it doesn't do any type of code completion in terms of like blocks and that type of thing yet. It's really just a namespace naming assistance type of feature, but it's pretty solid, and I think it'll help a lot. All right, moving on to the messages area. Excuse me. This hasn't changed too much. The main thing that's changed here is go ahead and compile something so that we can get some messages here. The main thing here is that you can do multi-select. So I can multi-select there, and I can either copy, delete, or save whatever I've selected. Previously, it was you could only clear all the messages at the bottom. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, you can still do you can double click on things to get debug information. None of these options here, or none of these messages have debug information with them, but the messages or the output window in general is going to get a little bit more full featured as things move on here with Elevate Web Builder 3. For example, there's going to be multiple tabs here for dealing with network tracing and error reporting, and it'll be less just textual based and more a series of tabs that are very contextual in terms of things like debugging, or things like network, or things like server management or service status information. So that'll get a little more fleshed out as we move along. All right, moving over to the project manager over here on the right. Again, there's three different managers here, but the project manager is the first one. The main differences here are you do have the ability to rename both projects and any given unit by either hitting F2 or just double clicking slowly on the actual name, so you can rename it to whatever you want. That is a rename also, it's not a save as. So it's a very easy way to change the name of a unit. It'll change the name of the unit both from a file name perspective and from a unit name perspective at the top here. And if it's also something that's available in the project source, it'll change the name there also. Also, when it comes to external files, if you do add external file, you're going to notice that there's now also a relative path button for the file name here, so you can specify that external file names are set up relative if they're local file names that need to be deployed with the server, or excuse me, with the application to the server, that you can specify that those are relative also. So again, allows you to easily move around projects without having to worry about changing any path names. Let's see what else. Okay, so that's it for the project manager. Not a lot's changed there. Everything's still the same in terms of like I can double click on a particular unit and it'll take me to that in the IDE. Moving on, the server manager is the next manager. This is a pretty complex beast, but I'm going to go over some basics about it just from the IDE standpoint. And again, this is going to be covered, more of the server management is going to be covered in a subsequent video that does a deeper dive. So first thing you're going to see here on the toolbar is this button right here is a toggle button. That's why it's highlighted. This just basically starts and stops the internal web server. By default, it's always started. and you're always going to want it to be running. But it does give you the ability to turn it down if you want to test. For example, if you want to test an application, is to see what it does if the server is not responding or is offline for some reason. This will give you the ability to turn it off and go ahead and run, like say, a client application and see how it handles a missing server, which is good for error testing. The other button here allows you to add a new server. And then this right here allows you to basically refresh any portion of the server management tree view. If anything's changed, you want to refresh it. Anything that's changed externally to the IDE, anything you change in the IDE, it's gonna know and automatically update the server manager. So, say somebody else in another location updated something on the server, you could refresh that to see it. So, what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna double click on the internal server to expand it, and you can kind of see a little brief overview of the various aspects that are available in the server. First thing though, I'm going to go ahead and edit the server so you can see this is how you set up a server in the server manager. You can give it a name. In this case, it's already given a name. What you do is you specify a base URL. In this case, it's HTTP. If you wanted to test with secure sockets though, you could change this to HTTPS. There's no need to for testing or development purposes, but before you actually deploy your application, that's a good way to test that. The internal server, you can specify the port, the non-secure port and the secure port, and of course auto start can be designated for the internal server. The auto start option is disabled for any external servers. Anything, in case I wasn't clear on this, anything that you define outside of the internal server is automatically assumed to be an external server that's not running in the IDE. So that's an important distinction. So what you do here is you specify what the username and password is for authentication with that server. That can be any username and password that's defined on the server, but just be aware that if it's not an administrator or it doesn't have certain privileges, certain features may or may not be available in the server manager. So if it's a non-admin, you might only see like things like databases and not or might only see the ability to deploy content. For example, you might not see the roles and privileges because you just don't have access to those. The next tab here is the resources. What this specifies are, from a client perspective, what the various resources are for various options that are available in the Elevate Web Builder web server. There's the Keep Alive resource, authentication resource. These are all the same as the default values. You can change these, but just be aware that this is there's a corresponding server setting on the server side. And again, this is just from the client perspective. This is from a client session running in a browser as to what these resource names are. And Elevate Web Builder in the client application will use these resource names to determine how it goes about accessing or building certain types of URLs for like database access and administration or authentication. So to further demonstrate how that works though, let's go ahead and we'll just start up a blank Visual Client project. But what you can do here is you can drag and drop a server onto a form, and this will basically set up a session that you can then use to authenticate your application with. I'm going to be doing again a more deep dive into how the server stuff works, especially with how the session handling works. But just know that by default this is set up as an anonymous user. The Elevate Web Builder web server allows you to set up or use an anonymous user with no password, and that is effectively the same as having no user. So you're probably not going to have access to a lot of stuff with an anonymous user, but you will be able to load content. So it could be used, for example, to load content, such as a client application, the JS and HTML, as well as any other type of external files from the content area of the website. So let's go back to the go go back to the server application here. So what little by little we'll go through various aspects of the server management. The first thing you have here is the privileges. The Elevate Web Builder 3 web server does have role-based access control, so you effectively have a series of privileges that are defined. There's a whole bunch of built-in privileges that deal with administration. You're free to add as many as you like, though, so you can add any number of application-specific privileges. And then these, you just specify the name of the privilege and a brief description. Then you have the roles. There's only 2 by default, 1 public and the other administrators. And of course, each role allows you to grant privileges to that role. So in this particular case, you'll see that obviously administrators are granted every privilege. Public is obviously the opposite. It's granted no administrative privileges. And these you can just drag and drop whatever privileges you want. So you can effectively set it up so that developers have deploy privileges, but that's it. So they can test their applications against a server and deploy them, as well as delete them or modify external files that are in the content area of the web server, and leave it at that, and then have separate stuff for administrators. So then you have your users, and obviously the users are added to roles. Users, you're given a name, a full name. You can designate an email address. That's not used at this time, but it will be fleshed out with some more notification stuff. So you'll be able to notify administrators if there's a server problem, and obviously that'll include text if you use a text or an email address that can subsequently text a user. There's login start and end times. By default, these are just set up for the entire 24 hours of the day, but you can specify that they can only log in at certain times. And then you have the roles. Again, you have the available and then granted. These can be drag and dropped. So a given user can be granted any number of roles, and effectively then their privileges are the union of all the granted privileges to the roles that they're granted. Databases. Databases are quite a bit different in some areas, and pretty much the same in other areas. We'll go through these briefly, but again, we're going to do a deep dive on the database handling and the API. But briefly, if I go in here to edit the example database, the thing you're going to notice is this is pretty much all the same. Properties are pretty much all the same. The main difference being here is that the database manager that was in Elevate Web Builder 2 was an IDE specific thing, and so it was local to the IDE, whereas in this case, the database name and some of the other things that you're going to see here, these could be actually relative to, in this case, they're in the internal web server, so they are still relative to the IDE. However, these could be properties that you're setting for a remote machine in the case of an external web server that's running on a different machine. So you just have to keep that in mind when you're defining these, so that you don't get yourself into trouble by defining things in reference to the local machine as opposed to the remote machine. That's especially true with ADO and ODBC. And then you're able to grant an access privilege. If the access privilege is blank, and this goes for all server objects, if they haven't been assigned a privilege, then they're visible to everybody. But if they have been assigned a privilege, if the user doesn't have that privilege or hasn't been granted that privilege, they will not be able to actually see the database. So that's a good way to eliminate a database from view for certain users. It's also a way, because the server applications and the client applications both use the same databases and data sets. This was done to basically eliminate the possibility of SQL injection attacks. So server applications refer to the same databases and data sets, and because of that, the access privileges allow you to effectively set things up where only server applications can see those databases and data sets. And the reason that is server applications don't actually obey the access privilege. That's only for client or external access to the web server. So if you have an access privilege you set up for a certain database that's basically just a dummy privilege, you can use it to effectively mask out databases from being internal and only used by server applications versus being external and available to client applications, which is a nice security feature to have. So moving on, under each database you have a series of data sets. Each one of these data sets itself have a series of dataset commands. So you can see here there's a number of dataset commands for the albums dataset. So how this works is you have your dataset itself, and now previously there was a bunch of different options for a dataset, including you would specify whether it was whether it was a table, whether it was a query. Now you only give it a name, description, and whether or not you want to localize date and time columns. And then what you can do then, though, is you can go ahead and generate the dataset commands from a base table on the server. And that's obviously determined by the available tables that are defined for the database that you're defining the dataset under. And then you can also select whether you want to generate select, insert, update, delete, blob select, or blob update commands. The reason for the dataset command changes, or why this was re-architected this way, is previously you couldn't update blobs or select blobs independently of the row itself. And that gets into a lot of problems, especially when you're talking about parameterized SQL, where you have to get into using conditional ifs with null parameters, and you effectively in the process lose the ability to set a blob column to null. Because null starts to take this place of a parameter designator as to whether or not a parameter was provided or not. In general, it's a mess. So this new change allows you to do that. So the way it works is when a transaction comes in for a particular data set, whether it's an insert or an update, Elevate Web Builder will go ahead and do the insert, and then it'll go ahead and update the blobs after the fact individually, depending on whether or not they were modified. That also is a good performance improvement, so you don't have to worry about all the blobs being sent over all the time. Or excuse me, blobs are only updatable from server applications, but you don't have to worry about server applications trying to update all of the blobs every time and having those go to the database server on the back end. So that's going to be a major performance improvement. The individual commands themselves, this is the other nice improvement about this, is if I look at the individual commands themselves, for example, this is the insert command for the album, you can actually change the SQL and make it manually do whatever you want it to do. The only requirement is that the parameter names match the names of the columns that you want to update. So those obviously being the names of the columns that are generated out through the select command. So if I look at the select command here, I'm just selecting all from albums. So whatever the columns names are in the albums, those are going to be the dataset column names, and those are going to be the parameter names that you're going to need to use with the insert, for example. But the flexibility that this gives you is twofold. One, it gives you the ability to effectively have a situation where you have in the select command selecting from a particular table or series of tables on the database server, and turn around and only update one of those tables, for example. But it effectively would make queries that are non-updatable in some database engines updatable, especially queries that use joins, for example. It also, the dataset commands in general allow you to designate datasets that have a select statement, for example, or a select command, but not insert, update, and delete, so that it's effectively a read-only dataset. So there's a lot of nice options there now by the re-architecture of the datasets into the various dataset commands. So that's pretty much how those work. And as I said, we'll get more into the actual database API itself and how that's been. It's basically gone from a parameter-based API to a RESTful API. So that'll be covered in the deep dive on the databases. So just checking my notes here. Oh, and of course, just like the database manager you had previously with Elevate Web Builder 2, you can drag and drop both databases and data sets from the server manager onto the work area. In the case of databases, you simply would drag and drop it into the tab area here at the top, and it will create a new database that has all of the data sets defined for that particular data base. You can also then turn around and drag and drop individual data sets. So I can also drop an existing data set or this existing data set onto the database here. And as you can see, if you do that, it'll ask you, do you want to create a new one or do you want to just go ahead and update it? So it's also a quick way of just updating a particular data set if you know the columns have changed, for example, because of a change in the select command for that data set. So I'm just going to say no, and it's going to go and create a new one. Go ahead and delete that. So that you still have drag and drop for the databases and data sets. So that's good. So moving on in the server manager, let's go ahead and close this. And okay, so the web server modules and the applications. So the way these work now is modules are native web server modules, and again, these are different from the external native modules, which are used to add native functionality to the server-side applications in the interpreter. Web server modules are the same as the native web server modules that were in Elevate Web Builder 2. Those are completely self-contained web server modules. They're very much like an ASAPI type DLL that can handle incoming requests independently. So there's no server application involved with a native web server modules or with a native web server module. And that's what these are here. And then here are where you have the actual server applications themselves. These are the interpreted applications, and these are where native external modules would be used, for example. Now, the way these work, though, is server applications, just like client applications, get deployed to the files area here. In this case, they get deployed to either applications for server applications, or in the case of client applications, they get deployed to the content area. So those both get deployed there, but the server applications and the native web server modules, the native web server modules also get deployed to the modules area. And then there's one extra step involved with the native web server modules and the server applications, and that extra step is that you have to actually install those. So, for example, in the case of the applications, I can go here and click on install, and then what this does is allows you to give the application a specific name, and it can be different from the actual file name that's used for the server application. And then you can select the actual file here. Like say I want to collect, or do want to do music collection, but I want to call it something else. Like say I'll just call it music. And then it allows you to also assign an execute privilege, which is useful when you want to be able to specify that there's a special privilege that you want to have that allows you to execute or not or have an application be visible to for execution, or have a native web server module be visible to a certain client, depending on what the user what user account was used to log in to the web server, or to then authenticate against the web server. So let's see. Oh, okay. And then of course the files area is effectively just a general purpose file manager. You can do a bunch of things here. You can create new folders. You can delete existing folders. You can upload files arbitrarily. Again, these are all privileged operations, so you either have to have these privileges to be able to do these operations. You can also download files, and so I can select multiple files here, for example, and download them if I don't have them locally. And what happens with download is it bundles them up into a zip file to save on download time. So we'll go ahead and zip those up and then send them down as a single zip, especially if you multi-select. And this is also important for the logs. The one thing the Elevate Web Builder web server has is two separate types of logging systems. One is the request logging, and the other one is the system logging, which is more like audit logging. The differences are the request logging is a CSV format that just simply has a single line for each request coming into the web server with some basic information about the HTTP request itself, things like the HTTP method used, the URL, the parameters, some basic header information like content type, the content size, if there's content included, and so those could actually get pretty large. That's why they're in a CSV format. And then the audit logs are in a different format. Those are in a JSON format because they are basically variable length. And can have various information and depending on what it is it's being logged. But it will log any type of information about any management done with the server objects, any type of audit level things like authentication or any time a deployment is done. So you get 100% visibility into how the various operations that are done on the web server are handled. Which is nice to have. And again, these can be downloaded in a group by simply just multi-selecting which logs you want to download and then clicking on download, and it'll bundle those up as a zip. So that's pretty much it as far as this server management is concerned. Two things I forgot to mention. On a given server, you also have a couple different options here. One is a migrate server option. This allows you to migrate a given server to another server, and allows you to specify what you want to migrate and then also how to handle duplicates if there are any duplicates. So this is very nice where you, in a situation where you've done all your development using the internal web server and then you're all ready to deploy everything, and you want to go ahead and migrate all the server objects that you've created and have all set up nice and neat, along with any content that you've also set up for client applications. And you can just do that with one single click, and it's very quick, and it'll get everything moved over in a rapid fashion. So that makes it very easy to move from development to production. The other thing that you have here is a server status, and all this does is gives you a little quick overview of various information about the server, which is useful especially when it's remote. In this case, memory usage is actually the local server itself, but you can see number of sessions, you can see HTTP connections, HTTP IO information, and the same thing with the secure port with the HTTPS information. So that's nice to know if you suspect that you've got a load issue or something along those lines. You can exactly see how many sessions you've got or connections and see exactly what's going on. And finally, that's pretty much it for the server manager. And finally, you have the request manager. This is where you define the requests that are used in with server applications to drive the execution of server applications. And you can see here, you select these over on the Run menu. And again, these allow you to effectively form or define the HTTP requests that you use to debug or test out the server application. And these, again, you'll see all the ones for the music collection and the photo album. Those are defined for you when you install the example application, so you won't have to do those manually, and they allow you to test out various aspects of the example server applications that we include. This is the one that we've got selected right now, which is the set track media ID. So we'll take a look at that one just to give you an idea of how this works. So you give it a name, you give it a description, and then you choose the HTTP method you want to use. In this case, this is a patch because it's an update to an existing RESTful URI or URL. And you see here, this is in the path. We have the actual ID of the track that we want to use. or excuse me, of the album, and then we have / and then we have the actual track number. And so that's how the patch method works. And what happens is it sends over a JSON payload that has the YouTube track ID that it wants to set. And you can see here when you go to the content, you can specify several different ways of specifying the content to be sent over. In this case, it's sending over text content, which is JSON. You specify the content type here. There's a bunch of built-ins that you can use. Application JavaScript or JSON work the same, so it doesn't really matter. In the case of more than just text content, if you do file content, for example, you can specify the file name and along with the file content type that you want to send over. You can also do mixed text and file, and then you can do mixed form file content. I'll show you how that works here. If I look at this one's a test. Well, let's do the image upload for the photo album. If you look at the content for this, you can see it's a form data upload. So what you have here is you have the key value pairs that specify the file name, and then you have the actual file name itself and the file content type. So when you run this, it's going to effectively upload this 226 JPEG file to the server application, which is going to have to know how to handle that, obviously. Excuse me. And then finally, you have the ability to set custom headers. These are set just like you would any HTTP header, so you can basically say, I'll just use date here, but you can just say date and then the date structure itself. You don't have to set content type or anything like this. This is mainly for real custom headers that you would need for your server application, whatever that need may be. So you can effectively structure the entire HTTP request using the request manager, and then use that to drive the server applications as you like. So again, we're going to go into more in depth with the server applications in a subsequent video, but I think that pretty much wraps it up. So that's really the tour of the new IDE. Hopefully that's given you a better understanding of how everything works. And if you have any questions about what you're seeing here, please feel free to add them in the comments section below, and I'll try to get to them as soon as they show up. And thanks you for your time, and look forward to moving on with Elevate Web Builder 3 here. Thanks.